All right, we're going to continue with Calvin's Company of Pastors. This is part 3, as we've transitioned into chapter 2. This is Pastoral Care and the Emerging Reformed Church, 1536 to 1609. In chapter 2, we move into the Company of Pastors. Over the course of his ministry in Geneva, John Calvin recruited hundreds of men to be pastors of Reformed congregations in various corners of Europe. None of these ministers proved to be of greater importance for Reformed Protestantism than Theodore Beza, 1519 to 1605. Calvin first met Beza in the fall of 1548, several weeks after the young Frenchman had converted to the evangelical faith and, with his wife, Claudine Dinos, or Dinosé perhaps, fled Catholic France to find a safe haven in Geneva. Though not yet 30 years of age, Beza's credentials were already impressive. The product of Burgundy's lower nobility, he was refined in his cultural tastes and at ease in the presence of people of power and wealth. His academic training and intellectual gifts were also impeccable. As a young man, he had been trained in civil law and the humane letters. At the time of his religious conversion, he was a member of the distinguished Sodality of Catholic Humanists in Paris, and he was an accomplished poet with a superb command of classical Greek. Calvin possessed a keen eye for talent and immediately recognized Beza's enormous potential as a churchman and a scholar. Not only did Calvin encourage him to employ his intellectual and literary gifts on behalf of the evangelical cause, but he helped him secure an academic post teaching Greek at the Reformed Academy of Lausanne. 10 years later, Calvin again recruited Beza, this time inviting him to return to Geneva to serve as the rector of the newly founded Genevan Academy and as a city preacher. Over the 2 years, a deep bond of friendship and trust was forged between the two men, due in large part to their shared labors for the gospel, their common concern for France, and Beza's unflinching loyalty to his spiritual mentor. Quote, "I would be very cold-hearted," unquote, Calvin noted, quote, "if I did not care deeply for Beza, who loves me more than a brother and honors me more than a father," unquote. Clearly, Calvin became, for Beza, what Bucer had once been for Calvin, a spiritual father, a theological mentor, a trusted friend, a guide who helped him discover his pastoral vocation. When Calvin died in May of 1564, Beza was the natural choice to succeed the reformer as the leader of the Genevan church. Theodore Beza was the most distinguished of a battalion of Reformed ministers who worked alongside or succeeded Calvin in the Genevan church during the 16th and early 17th centuries. Between 1536 and 1609, Calvin, Beza, and the Company of Pastors recruited over 130 men to preach and provide pastoral care in Geneva's city and countryside churches. Several of these ministers were well-known churchmen and highly regarded theologians whose influence extended well beyond the shores of Lac Léman. The majority of the pastors, however, were men of more modest abilities and stature, who served their congregations and died in relative obscurity. In this chapter, I will describe Calvin's initial efforts to recruit a competent pastoral company for Geneva's churches and provide quantitative evidence as to the geographic origins, social location, and educational backgrounds of these ministers. These findings will be compared to the profile of Geneva's ministers following Calvin's death in order to highlight general trends and important changes in the composition and backgrounds of the Venerable company during the 7 decades following the Revolution of 1536. The men who served Geneva's church as pastors during these years fit into one of 3 general categories: long-term foreign ministers, short-term foreign ministers, and native ministers. The second section of this chapter will illustrate each of these ministerial models through the careers of several of the more prominent pastors. In the final section of this chapter, I'll briefly explore the ways in which the leadership of the Company of Pastors was constructed and sometimes contested during the generations immediately following Calvin's death. Part 1. Geneva's ministers in profile. When Calvin returned to Geneva from Strasbourg in September of 1541, one of the most urgent tasks at hand was to recruit a new group of ministers for the churches of the city and countryside. Unfortunately, Calvin was unable to secure from Lausanne the permanent services of the eloquent preacher Pierre Viret Instead, the Genevan church was forced to recruit a group of pastors who, although they showed promise, were still far from ideal. Calvin provided a blunt assessment of some of his colleagues' more blatant weaknesses in his correspondence during the following year. He says, "Our other colleagues are more a hindrance than a help to us." Calvin wrote to Oswald Myconius in March 1542. He says, "They are proud and self-conceited. They have no zeal, less learning. But what is worst of all, I can't trust them, even though I very much wish that I could." The reformer provided specific details in letters to Farel and Viret later that summer. The city minister, Philippe de Ecclesia, was a poor preacher and unpopular with the people. The minister, Pierre Blanchet, was engaged in a bitter dispute with his brother-in-law, Sebastian Castellio, that had become the talk of the town. Blanchet was showing tendencies which are not very satisfactory, Calvin noted. The other city ministers were making progress in their preaching, although two of them displayed an unhealthy penchant for vainglory. As for the pastor Louis Treperoux, he has more levity and less self-control in his conversation and behavior than becomes a minister of the gospel. Calvin also reported that the pastor of Jussy, Nicholas Vander, had unwisely criticized Geneva's magistrates in a judicial case and would soon be deposed, and possibly disposed, from his post. His likely replacement, Henry de la Mare, was scarcely better. "Surely men like these are nothing in comparison with Viret," Calvin bemoaned. Overall, this group of ministers recruited to serve Geneva's churches in the early years of 1540, or the 1540s, did not fare very well. Calvin aside, the average length of service of the 10 city ministers hired from 1541 to 1544 was 3 years. The average length of service. Of this group, 2 men died, 3 were deposed, and 3 were transferred to countryside parishes. The overall effect of such high turnover was to sow instability and turmoil, weakening the church's ability to provide competent pastoral care. The appointment of Nicolas de Gallards to Geneva's pastoral company in 1544 signaled an important new stage in Calvin's recruitment efforts. De Gallards was from Paris, a man of noble birth, who possessed legal training, rich exposure to the humanities, and polished Latin. De Goulart served the Genevan church for over a dozen years, both as a pastor and as a translator and editor of Calvin's writings. Therefore, his career path led him to pastoral posts in London and Orleans, a role as deputy of the Colloquy of Poissy in 1561, and a brief chaplaincy in the court of the Queen of Navarre, Jean Delbray. Other men of de Goulart's stature and quality soon followed him to Geneva. Between 1545 and 1559, Calvin attracted to Geneva's pastoral company an impressive group of talented and well-educated French ministers who shared his reformed commitment and who were loyal to him. These pastoral recruits included Michael Kopp, nobleman François Bourgogne, and François Morel, a former Franciscan monk named Raymond Chauvet, the future theologian Nicolas Caledon, and Theodore Beza. The city ministers recruited by Calvin from 1545 to 1559 enjoyed much longer tenures in office, 14 years on average. That's a significant improvement, which elevated the quality of preaching and brought greater stability of leadership to the city's churches. It was also in the mid-1540s that the company of pastors began to take a shape as a formal ecclesiastical institution. By 1546, the company was meeting for several hours every Friday morning to transact the business of local churches and maintain formal contact with Reformed congregations elsewhere in Europe. In time, the membership of the company numbered around 20 men, including between 7 and 10 city ministers, 9 to 11 rural pastors, and several professors from Geneva's academy, usually the professors of theology, Greek and Hebrew, and the arts. During the 3/4 of a century after the Revolution of 1536, a total of 135 men belonged to Calvin's companies of pastors. And there's an appendix here that I'll read later. 135 men. The next important period of the development of the company of pastors occurred in the years surrounding Calvin's death in 1564. Around a half a dozen prominent city ministers died or departed during these pivotal years, including Jean Macquard, he died in 1560, Michael Kopp, who died in 1566, Louis Enoch died in 1567, and Jean-Raymond Merlin deposed in 1564. They were replaced by a younger cadre of pastors, nearly all expatriate Frenchmen who were well-trained and deeply committed to the work of pastoral ministry. These new arrivals who joined Beza included Jean Tremblay, minister from 1560 to 1596, Jean Pinol, 1560 to 1606, Charles Perrault, 1564 to 1608, Jean Jacquemot, 1566 to 1615, and Simon Goulart, 1566 to 1628. To this elite group were added a decade or so later two other foreigners, the Frenchman Antoine de la Fay, 1577 to 1615, and a Swiss pastor named David Le Boitou, 1577 to 1612. So that was 8 men. These 8 men, Beza, Tremblay, Pinol, Perrault, Jacquemot, Goulart, La Fay, and Le Boitou, quickly became permanent fixtures in the city pulpits and provided primary leadership for the company of pastors into the 17th century. Their combined service to the Genevan Church was more than 350 years, with an average tenure of more than 4 decades. Well, things have changed radically. This long generation of pastoral leadership brought with it several important consequences for religious life in Geneva. Lengthy pastoral tenures no doubt served to stabilize religious life in the city and appear to have translated into growing professional competence on the part of the ministers. But gray hair often brought with it increased frailty and illness, and probably contributed to a conservative spirit resistant to change. In addition, pastoral longevity in Geneva city churches may have made it more difficult for Beza and the company of pastors to recruit younger men, particularly those Genevan youths who aspire to the pastoral vocation in service of their mother church. A fourth stage of pastoral recruitment began in the mid-1590s as the leaders of Geneva's pastoral corps, who made up of this long generation, Beza, Tremblay, Pinol, and Perrault, began to pass from the scene and were replaced by younger men who would lead Geneva's church for the next several decades. Pastors such as Gabriel Cusson, minister from 1598 to 1617, Jean Gros, 1601 to 42, Jean Diodati, 1608 to 1645, and Theodore Tronchin, 1608 to 1657. This new group of ministers represented the future of Geneva's company of pastors. Most were native Genevans. Nearly all had formal theological training, and many were the sons of pastors. By way of summary, then, during these 7 decades following the Revolution of 1536, one can discern 4 periods or generations of pastoral leadership in Geneva. So there's the period of disruption, 1536 to 1544, a period of construction, 1545 to around 1559, a period of consolidation, 1560 to mid-1590s, and a period of indigenization, a period of indigenization and professionalization after 1594. So here's the periods: the disruption, construction, consolidation, indigenization, and professionalization. To this point, and so the period for those are beginning with disruption in 1536 and then going all the way up to after 1594. So what is that? It's roughly 60 years, 58 years. To this point, I've described the pastoral personnel who served Geneva's 3 city temples, Saint Pierre, Saint Gervais, and the Madeleine. Recruiting pastors for Geneva's rural churches was altogether a different matter. As previously noted, several of Geneva's countryside parishes did not have a reformed minister until the 1540s, and even then, the quality of these ministers frequently left something to be desired. In the following decades, the company of pastors did succeed in recruiting higher caliber pastoral candidates for Geneva's rural churches, but these ministers rarely stayed long in their posts. Between 1540 and 1609, the duration of clerical assignments in countryside parishes remained static, averaging around 5 years. The brevity of rural assignments had several causes. Countryside pulpits were often filled with theological students or young graduates of the academy who had no intention of remaining in Geneva long term. So, too, the company of pastors often treated rural parishes as testing grounds for inexperienced pastors, with the most promising among them soon transferring to the city church. And as we'll see later, this pattern was far from Calvin's ideal, but it proved to be the reality nonetheless. That's not to say that all rural assignments were of short duration. Abraham de la Maisonneuve, for example, spent the first 6 years of his career in the parish of Quelegny, moved to the church of Gentaud-Moens, where he served for 17 years, before spending the last 7 years of his life as pastor at Saint-Gervais within the city walls. As a general rule, however, rural parishes could expect their pastors to remain for only 5 or 6 years before they died, were transferred to a city post, or quit the Genevan church altogether. Having described the pattern of development of the company of pastors between 1536 and 1609, I now explore the geographic origins, social locations, and educational backgrounds of the men who staffed Geneva's churches. Of the 135 ministers who labored in Geneva during these years, the geographic origins of 114 of them are known. So 114 of the 135, we know some things. Table 2.1 identifies the geographic regions from which these ministers came, categorized by the time period in which they were first enrolled in the company of pastors. During the years 1536 to 1609, most of Geneva's ministers whose geographic origins are known were recruited from France. That's 72%. 72% from France, with a smaller percent of pastors drawn from Geneva, about 22%. The region of Vaud, 4%, and other Swiss cantons, 3%. The French presence within the company of pastors was especially strong before 1570, when 59 of the 64 known ministers were Frenchmen. The percentage of French ministers working in Geneva declined somewhat between 1570 and 1609, but still more than half the ministers appointed during this period were French-born. Not surprisingly, recruitment was highest from the regions of France located nearest to Geneva, for example, Dauphine and Burgundy, or in areas where Huguenot strength was concentrated, for example, Provence, Languedoc, Guyenne, and Poitou. On the other hand, only a handful of ministers came from the Swiss Confederation, although several of them were more prominent members of the company, such as Jean-Baptiste Rotin from the Grisons, as well as Pierre Viret, Antoine Chauvet, and David La Boitou from the Pays de Vaud. And then the little table here on page 43 sort of breaks that down, and we'll skip over that. The relatively smaller number of Genevan-born men who served the church between 1536 and 1609 is surprising. As Table 2.1 indicates, only 25 Genevan natives are known to have held pastoral posts in the city and countryside parishes over these 7 decades. That is remarkable. 7 decades, and only 25 pastors were native to Geneva. During the early periods of the company's existence, that's 1536 to 1559, the only local men who belonged to Geneva's pastoral corps were 2 former Catholic clergymen, the priest Jacques Baud and the one-time Franciscan Jacques Bernard. Both of these men came from prominent families in and around Geneva. At the time of the Reformation, they converted to the evangelical religion and were assigned to countryside parishes. Other than these 2 men, no native Genevans were admitted to the company of pastors during Calvin's lifetime. This dearth of local leadership began to be corrected during the 1570s. In that decade, 5 native sons entered Geneva's pastoral corps, all assigned to rural parishes. 20 years later, in 1594, Abraham Grenet, along with Abraham de la Maisonneuve, became the first Genevans assigned to the most prestigious parish churches within the city walls. The middle years of the 1590s thus represent an important period of transition in the composition of the company of pastors. As graph 2.1 makes clear. After 1594, hiring patterns swung decidingly in the favor of local candidates, and the number of native Genevans serving parishes in the city and countryside began to increase steadily. Of the 8 city posts that became available from 1594 to 1609, 6 were filled by Genevans. By the year 1609, 4 native pastors held posts within the city walls, and another 7 were serving parishes in the countryside. The recruitment of ministers in the 16th century Geneva runs counter to the pattern witnessed in most other Reformed territories. Scholars have shown that in Reformed cities such as Zurich, Bern, Basel, Strasbourg, a significant number of Catholic clergy converted to the Protestant faith at the time of the Reformation in the 1520s, forming the nucleus of the new ministerial order. Not so in Geneva, where the vast majority of all Catholic, secular, and regular clergy abandoned the city at the time of the Revolution. So, too, the indigenization of Geneva's pastoral corps occurred much more slowly than in most other Reformed churches. In Basel, for example, by the 1550s, more than half of newly appointed ministers came from Basel or its rural territory. And the same pattern is evident in Zurich, where by the middle of the century, the majority of Reformed pastors were natives, with many coming from clerical families. In Geneva, by contrast, recruitment of local talent to the pastoral office became common practice only at the very end of the 16th century. As a consequence, supervision of religious life in Geneva fell almost exclusively to foreign-born ministers during the first generation after Calvin's death, a fact that many townspeople in Geneva were acutely aware of and resented deeply. That seems understandable to some degree. What might explain the Company of Pastors' slow assimilation of native-born ministers into its ranks? Theodore Beza saw the dearth of local leadership as a serious problem and had clear opinions as to its root causes. Writing to the Zurich minister Rudolf Gualther in 1584, Beza complained about the local situation. He says, "I congratulate your church because God has blessed you, for not only do you not have to borrow pastors and professors from elsewhere, but you have a surplus and can assist other cities. The opposite is the case here in Geneva, where, if it had not been for foreigners, either the sheep would have been without shepherds and the schools without teachers, or God would have had to do something extraordinary." God would have had to do something extraordinary. Beza blamed the problem primarily on the spiritual apathy and greed of Geneva's parents, who slighted their children's education, neglected the Word of God, and encouraged sons to pursue more lucrative careers in the trades or commerce rather than in theology and the sacred ministry. Though there are maybe some truth to Beza's accusation, there were several other factors that were probably equally as important. First, the academic training expected of ministerial candidates was rigorous, and it's time-consuming and expensive. As these requirements increased over the course of the 16th century, some young men in Geneva lacked the intellectual ability or the economic resources to pursue theological studies. Second, whereas Protestant churches elsewhere set in place generous stipendiary systems to support ministerial education, the Company of Pastors was not so successful in establishing a viable scholarship program for needy students, local or otherwise. In the generation following the foundation of Calvin's Academy, Beza and his colleagues were never able to raise sufficient funds to support more than a handful of students. Only 2 local youths who were the beneficiaries of these scholarships ever became pastors in Geneva's church. A third factor that must have discouraged local young men from pursuing pastoral vocations in Geneva was the preponderance of foreign ministers in the most important pulpits of the church. Even if well-known foreign ministers like Calvin, Beza, Goulart added luster to Geneva's reputation in the Protestant world, their presence also reduced the availability of desirable city posts and may well have left the impression that clerical careers were for high-placed foreigners, not local young men of less illustrious pedigrees. To these 3 factors, which point toward an inadequate supply of qualified native candidates, we must add a fourth factor that addresses the dynamics of power within the company of pastors. Namely, Beza and his foreign-born colleagues regularly chose to appoint ministerial candidates who were like themselves, foreigners and usually Frenchmen. An episode from 1585 is most telling in this regard. In that year, the ministers elected to a city post the Vaudois pastor David Le Boitou, who had served the countryside parish of Russin Dardagny for the previous 8 years. David Le Boitou had served the countryside parish for the previous 8 years. The small council objected to this choice, however, concerned that Le Boitou's voice wasn't strong enough for a city pulpit and fearful that Abraham de la Maisonneuve, a native Genevan and a son of a syndic who had already served rural churches for 15 years, would be disheartened and angry for being passed over. Despite the magistrate's reservations, the ministers persisted and Le Boitou was installed at Saint-Gervais. Another decade was to pass before La Maisonneuve was finally appointed to a city post. As this case suggests, Beza and many of his French colleagues did not attach a high priority to cultivating native ministers to lead Geneva's church. Their concern was to find the best qualified man for the post, and in their eyes, that usually meant appointing a foreign candidate. This culture of preference finally began to change in the early 17th century, however, when Geneva's magistrates started mandating that the company of pastors hire local ministers to prominent city posts. In January of 1607, the company of pastors nominated Samuel Pirot, a foreign-born minister serving the rural parish of Satigny, to fill a pastoral post in the city. The small council rejected this choice and ordered the company to hold a new election, giving preference to citizens. Spokesmen for the ministers protested strongly against this injunction, arguing that it seemed entirely without precedent to the company, since in such elections one had never before considered the distinction between bourgeois and citizens, but the only abilities and capacities that God had given to the candidates. The magistrates would not back down, however, and the ministers were forced to capitulate. In a second election, the company of pastors selected a Genevan citizen named Mathieu Scarron, who had received only one vote on the first ballot, to fill the pastoral vacancy in the city. From this point on, the criteria for evaluating ministerial candidates included not only educational training and ability, but also geographical background. By the early 17th century, the office of minister had become a more attractive and accessible vocation option for a growing number of Genevan young men. What is known about the social background of the men who worked alongside Calvin, Beza, and Goulart? The profession or social location of the fathers of around 1/3 of the 135 ministers who served Geneva's churches between 1536 and 1609 have been identified in Table 2.2. This table indicates that Geneva's pastoral company was recruited almost entirely from the urban classes of French-speaking Europe, as well as France's nobility. No ministers are known to have come from the world of rural agriculture or from the ranks of day laborers. The prominence of noblemen is especially striking. According to my sample, more than 1/4, 12 out of 42, of Geneva's ministers whose social background is known came from aristocratic families. More often than not, these ministers, often of high birth, were prominent French pastors who migrated to Geneva, and Calvin, during seasons of severe persecution and served alongside Calvin and Beza for a short period of time before returning to their churches in France. It always fascinates me how God uses persecution to spread the church. And I guess the 16th century and 17th century were no exception. The roll call of these noble churchmen includes some of the most important leaders of French Protestantism in the middle decades of the 16th century. François Morel, Nicolas de Galars, Pierre, and his last name, I don't think I can, it's Derbadus, Pierre, we'll just call him Pierre or Peter, Adam Doraville, Lambert Daneau, and Antoine Antoine de Chandoux. Two other French refugees with noble pedigrees, that's Theodore Beza and Jean Tremblay, settled in Geneva permanently and had long careers as pastors of the city's church. After Calvin's death, the practice of appointing noblemen to Geneva's pastoral office became less common, with only 3 ministers of aristocratic backgrounds known to have been recruited between 1564 and 1609. This development reflected in part changes in immigration patterns among France's Protestant nobility during the protracted wars of religion. So too, longer tenures among Geneva's clergy and, as a result, greater stability of the company of pastors meant that there were less need for noble foreigners to fill pastoral posts on a short-term basis. Scholars have long recognized that Protestantism in the 16th century France was primarily an urban religion, attracting converts predominantly from the ranks of artisans, merchants, and liberal professions. This same pattern is seen in the social makeup of Geneva's clergy during this period, with a majority drawn from the middling rank of urban society. As the table 2.2, which you can't see, indicates, 4 of the ministers were the sons of Geneva's chief magistrates, or syndics. 3 other ministers whose backgrounds have been identified came from families of merchants or artisans, including a merchant, a goldsmith, and a tailor. A large number of Beza's colleagues, 13 out of 42, were the sons of lawyers, judges, notaries, professors, and physicians, members of the liberal professions who formed this intellectual elite of urban society. Several ministers from this group came from French families of influence and social prestige. Charles and Denis Perrot, for example, were the sons of a councillor of the Parliament of Paris. Michael Kopp was the son of Guillaume Kopp, or William Kopp, royal physician to Francis I, and the brother of Nicolas Kopp, the famous rector of the University of Paris. Pierre Prévost's father was a professor of the humanities at Lausanne, and briefly, the principal of the College of Geneva. To this list of prominent urban professionals should be added the ministers who came from clerical homes. 9 of the ministers in the sample are known to have been sons of the Reformed pastors, including Etienne Tremblay, whose father served the Genevan church for nearly 4 decades, as well as Jean Gros and his brother Etienne the Younger, who were born in the parish of Jussy, where their father was a pastor. Although it's too soon to speak of clerical dynasties, what is clear is that by the beginning of the 17th century, an increasing percentage of pastoral candidates were coming from pastoral households. The large representation of men from the liberal professions, the absence of candidates drawn from the peasant class, the growing number of ministers coming from clerical homes, in each of these ways, pastoral recruitment in Geneva reflected similar patterns evident in other Reformed cities and territories during the period. Where Geneva was unique was in the large number of foreign noblemen who served as city ministers, particularly during the first decades of the Genevan Reformation. Having examined the geographical and social backgrounds of Geneva's ministers, I now turn to their educational training. Table 2.3, which of course you can't see, breaks down the educational backgrounds of Geneva's ministers between 1536 and 1609, by period in which they were first enrolled in the company of pastors. Unfortunately, it is impossible to construct a detailed profile of the educational backgrounds of Geneva's first Protestant ministers between 1536 and 1544 because nothing's known about the formal training of over half the ministers. Though several of Calvin's first colleagues possessed university training and even doctorates in theology, other ministers appear to have been ill-equipped to serve their churches. Many years later, the pastor Antoine de la Fay quipped that these first ministers belonging to the Venerable company were not even qualified to watch goats. As Calvin set about building Geneva's pastoral company between 1545 and 1559, so 1545 and 1559, the percentage of ministers who possess university education appeared to have increased. Not only Theodore Beza, but Michael Kopp, Claude Bauduel, Nicolas Colladon, and Jean-Raymond Merlin all received education in the humane letters, and with it the knowledge of Greek or Hebrew, or both. The founding of Geneva's Academy in 1559 represented an important milestone in Calvin's efforts to elevate the theological competence of ministers both in Geneva and throughout the Reformed world. Well over half, 47 out of 83, the pastoral candidates admitted to the company of pastors between 1560 and 1609 are known to have received theological training at the academy. Students were drawn to the academy by its excellent faculty and uncompromising commitment to Reformed doctrine. In addition to Calvin, early professors included such illustrious Protestant scholars as Beza and Lambert Daneau, theology, François Barraud and Isaac Casaubon, Greek, Bonaventure Bertram, Hebrew, Claude Bauduel and Esai Caledon, the arts, François Hartmann and Jacques Lecht taught law. During its first 5 years in existence, the Academy matriculated 339 students, the majority of who came from France, in order to prepare for Protestant ministry. By the end of the century, nearly 1,500 students had studied at the Schola Publica, including the sons of princes and magistrates, and many of Europe's leading Reformed pastors and theologians. One of the institution's first students was Daneau, who later recalled, and these are his words, "In 1560, I came to your academy full of enthusiasm, not because it was near the French border, for there were others nearby, but because it offered to me the purest source of that heavenly doctrine held by my mentor, the martyred jurist Anne du Bourg. I will say freely that so many leading lights, so many talented and famous men in all branches of knowledge were in that city, that it seemed to me to be one of the richest markets for intellectual commerce in the world." Unlike Europe's universities, Calvin's academy did not impose matriculation fees and had no authority to confer academic degrees. Calvin's academy did not impose matriculation fees and had no authority to confer academic degrees. Well, that would certainly be unappealing today. Students were often in residence for only several months or a year, acquiring basic instruction in Reformed theology and scriptural exegesis before returning to their home countries to undertake gospel labors. While in Geneva, they were formed not only through lectures and academic disputations, but also through daily sermons, Sunday worship services, and as well as the culture of moral discipline present in the city. Consequently, the substance and quality of theological education provided was viewed favorably in many corners of Protestant Europe. I think this model would work in a lot of countries that don't have the level of free time that Americans have, having lived most of my life outside the U.S., and in countries where going to seminary would not be an option. For most of the clergy, having something like this certainly has appeal. A Genevan magistrate named Jacob Enjolras, who was sent to the Low Countries on a fundraising mission in 1597, reported back on how the Dutch churches perceived Calvin's academy. This is the Dutch perception of Calvin's academy. Quote, "The academy had flourished thanks to the reputation and worth of the outstanding people whose fame was and is known throughout the world, be it in theology, law, or in Hebrew, Greek, and arts. Therefore, those who have had the opportunity to study under such professors are considered to be very learned. However, this would be of very little value if good discipline did not flourish as well. Geneva's reputation in this field is not small because of the order and discipline that prevails there. As such, the young men who have spent time in Geneva are well thought of as being well trained, and because of this, they are placed more quickly in parishes." Unquote. Well, that's a nice sales tract for the academy in Geneva. In addition to theological training at Calvin's academy, many of Geneva's ministers during the half-century from 1560 to 1609 could boast a university education as well. I have been able to identify 25 of Geneva's pastors out of 83 total during this period who attended university. Several studied civil law in France before their conversions to the Protestant religion, notably Daneau, Bonaventure, Bertram, and Simon Goulart, Antoine de Chandoux, and Gaspard de la Faverge. I believe Calvin would have been in that camp as well. 4 ministers appeared to have earned doctorates: Daneau in law, Antoine de la Fay in medicine, and Jean-Baptiste Rotin and Jean Diodati in theology. Table 2.3 suggests that during the last decades of the 16th century, the percentage of Geneva's ministers overall who acquired some university education increased. Many pastoral candidates supplemented their training from the Genevan Academy with theological study at foreign universities. The most popular destinations where the faculties included such renowned... The most popular destinations were the Reformed universities of Heidelberg, Basel, and Leiden, whose theological faculties included such renowned scholars as Jérôme Zanchi, Jean-Jacques Grynaeus, Amandus Polanus, and Franciscus Junis. And thus, for example, a promising young Genevan named Theodore Tronchin, after having completed his academic work at the Genevan Academy in 1600, made a tour of Basel, Heidelberg, and Leiden in order to study theology and prepare for what turned out to be a long career as a pastor and professor in his house church. 6 other sons of Geneva are also known to have matriculated in one of these 3 theological faculties in the final decades of the sample. In fact, after 1580, 40% of the native Genevans who entered the company of pastors had studied abroad, a harbinger of the professionalization of Geneva's clerical office that occurred later in the 17th century. Even if Geneva's ministers as a group were better educated in 1600 than in 1560, their level of formal theological training was probably not exceptional when compared with Protestant ministers elsewhere. Social historians have shown that, at least until the early decades of the 17th century, most Protestant ministers in Europe received some theological education, although formal academic qualifications or degrees in theology remained rare, limited to most important officials of the Church. This was true of most regions of Lutheran Germany, as well as the Reformed Palatinate. Such was also the case in late 16th and early 17th century Geneva, where most of the ministers had received basic theological training from the academy, but only a few held advanced academic degrees. The fact that many members of the company of pastors shared the same educational background is important for several reasons. At the most basic level, the Academy's intensive program in theology and exegesis helped prepare Geneva's future ministers for their vocation of interpreting and preaching the Word of God. In addition, the students who received their theological training at the Academy were exposed to a single system of doctrine and a common religious culture. If the lecture hall introduced them to Reformed theology, the pattern of religious life in the city shaped their understanding of public worship and moral discipline and ministerial comportment. So too the fact that a sizable group of Geneva's ministers had learned Reformed theology at the feet of Beza and the Academy established the Reformer's theological leadership within the company of pastors and solidified his moral authority over Geneva's church. This common program of theological education and religious enculturation, as well as Beza's formidable leadership, goes far in explaining the confessional solidarity and cohesiveness displayed by the company of pastors during the half-century after Calvin's death. The evidence presented thus far allows us to identify 4 general trends. First, during the half-century after Calvin's death, the membership of the company of pastors went from being almost entirely foreign-born to becoming increasingly Genevan-born. Almost entirely foreign-born to becoming increasingly Genevan-born. By 1609, recruitment of native sons to the pastoral office was more than the rule than the exception. And second, during the same period, the social location of Geneva's ministerial corps became more firmly rooted in the middling level of urban society, a development suggested both by the reduction of the number of French noblemen serving the church and by the increasing number of ministerial candidates drawn from clerical homes. And third, as we've seen, the Academy of Geneva was of strategic importance in creating an educated and cohesive clerical company. By the beginning of the 17th century, however, more and more pastoral candidates chose to supplement their training from the Academy with advanced theological education at Reformed universities elsewhere in Europe. And finally, the length of pastoral careers in Geneva increased steadily during the 16th century, and the average age of city ministers grew progressively older. Nevertheless, the fact that clerical assignments in the countryside remained of relatively short duration raises the question about the overall quality of pastoral care provided in Geneva's rural parishes. And that's the completion of the first part of chapter 2, which is almost halfway through this chapter, so it perhaps would make sense to pause there for today. And this is Calvin's Company of Pastors, Pastoral Care, and the Emerging Reformed Church, 1536 to 1609.